Okay, in this video, I want to give you some further feedback on reading response number 2. Before we get into the specifics though, I just want to say I was thoroughly impressed by the improvement that I saw in all of your papers compared to reading response number 1. So a lot of you should see this reflected in your grades. A lot of you got a letter grade higher on this paper for your grade for the Robert Putnam reading response in comparison to the Jeffrey Toobin reading response. So you guys are doing great. Just keep it up and you're going to be really successful in my class. I'm honestly really impressed. I don't think I've had other classes in the past make such significant improvements in their writing as my classes this semester have. So you guys are, whatever you're doing it right. Just keep it up. Okay, so what was I looking for in terms of your summary of the Putnam article? Well, first I was looking for you to acknowledge, mention, understand, demonstrate that you understood that the primary argument of the Putnam article is that there is an overall decline in social capital and civic engagement from generation to generation. So he's sort of comparing the post-World War II generation. Probably for a lot of you in this class, this would be your grandparents or even your great-grandparents. And he compares that generation to people in the early 2000s, late 1990s, I should say. This book was published in 2000, so it's about 20 years old at this point. But I think it's still relevant because Putnam does think that technology has something to do with the decline in social capital and civic engagement. So I wanted you to reflect on that further in this class 20 years later. Technology, social media is even more ubiquitous, more universal than it was 20 years ago. And so is technology good or bad for social capital and civic engagement? So a lot of you guys discussed that. You addressed that in this paper without me having to even sort of ask you to. If you didn't use technology, you didn't discuss technology in your reading response, like don't freak out. I wasn't necessarily requiring that you mention that. I just wanted to use this reading to evaluate the role of technology in American politics further. So I also was looking for you to define social capital as well as distinguish between bonding social capital and bridging social capital. These were concepts that were essential to Putnam's argument. So most of you defined these already, but if you didn't do so in your first body paragraph, and I wrote a note to you that your summation of Putnam could have been more thorough, well, here's an example of something that you could have addressed that maybe you didn't address in that first body paragraph. The last thing that I was looking for you to kind of discuss is why this matters. Why, in other words, why should we care that people are not attending city council meetings anymore? People aren't going to the Parent Teachers Association meetings on Wednesday nights. People aren't voting as much. People aren't contacting their House of Representative members or their senators to the same extent that they used to. Why do we care? Like what does social capital and civic engagement have to do with the maintenance of our democracy and our democratic institutions? So I was sort of looking for you to answer this question, like why does this matter? Or why should we care? So let's talk about specific things that I found in reading responses and things that you can address going forward in this class and future reading responses. One thing that I found, same thing with reading response 1, is that a lot of you are making arguments, but you're failing to back up those arguments with extensive evidence and support. Let me give you a couple examples of this. So here is a statement that I read in a reading response. This student wrote, "We are all aware that older people, baby boomers, are more likely to turn out to elections than younger adults." There's actually nothing wrong with this statement. This is a good piece of evidence if you want to agree with Putnam that there has been a decline in civic engagement. However, what's missing here is there is no citation. So I can't trust that this empirical claim, this factual statement that the student is making about election turnout, I can't trust that it's true because there's no citation. So tell me where you got that information from. Maybe you got it from the Pew Research Center, in which case I could write out Pew Research Center. Let's say it's an article that was published in 2019, and maybe it was a PDF that you can download. And so I found this information on page 8. Boom! Now I can trust that this evidence is credible and is accurate. So make sure whenever you're making factual claims that you have provided a source for your reader to check you with. A lot of you argued that Putnam is actually wrong, that people are just as politically engaged as they used to be, that there is just as much social capital being cultivated. However, we just do it in different ways now, and we do it in these different spaces. So for instance, you may have argued that by using current events, that instead of going to city council meetings and writing our congressmen, young people are attending rallies, that they're a part of social movements like March for Our Lives, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter. Maybe they're a part of a group or association that pursues LGBTQ plus issues with our politicians. So make sure that, when you argue that you agree or disagree with the author that I've assigned to you to read, you are kind of using evidence from the real world, maybe from current events, current politics, or things that have happened in recent past, to back up your claims so that I sort of have to agree with you. That's how you can make yourself as persuasive as possible. Here's another example of a good piece of evidence, but just one that wasn't specific enough. So this student wrote, basically they're arguing that we participate online more now than we do in person, and there's sort of nothing really wrong with that. So this student writes, as well, there are many online outlets that allow some to be a part of online communities with others that are interested in the same things that they are interested in. The one that comes most to mind is one I use called Reddit, where there are massive communities with tons of people actively expressing and learning from one another. Okay, in order to make sure that this piece of evidence is really persuasive, tell me exactly how many people are using Reddit on a regular basis. Are there 10 million users per day? Are there 10 million users per month? So on and so forth. In addition to that, what kind of conversations go on the Reddit platform? What kind of discussions are had? I know for a fact that Reddit is used to post current events and political news and information. So that's something that this student could have mentioned as well to make their argument even stronger. One thing I want to point out about writing style is I still read a lot of reading responses that are using I feel statements, okay? Never, ever, ever use I feel statements again in a college paper. The reason you don't say I feel in college papers or anything professional for that matter is because I feel it makes you sound like you're not certain of yourself. It makes you sound like you're hedging, like you don't have expertise in something that you are discussing in whatever is I'm reading. And so instead of saying I feel, you want to make yourself sound more convicted. So you could say things like, I contend, or I will argue, I disagree with Putnam. Save I feel statements for social media posts or your diary, journal entries, so on and so forth. Just don't say I feel in your college papers. I want to talk for a second about credible sources and citations. I saw a few papers that cited dictionary.com, investopedia.com, and Wikipedia. These are not credible sources because these are not primary sources. If you want to know more about this, feel free to stop by my Zoom office hours and we can talk more about this. But using something like dictionary.com is just lazy, and typically you want to avoid citing any sources that end in .com, with the exception of major newspapers like the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, maybe the Economist as well. And then I also read some reading responses that are attempting to cite things but are not citing things incorrectly. So if you'll notice, this student actually directly quotes Putnam. In recent years, social scientists have framed concerns about the changing character of American society in terms of the concept of social capital. Whenever you directly quote an author, or you indirectly, in your own words, quote an author, but whatever is being said is not common knowledge, not something that your grandma would know, then you need an in-text citation. So in Chicago style, the style that I'm asking you to cite in, you want to put the parentheses before actually everything else, before all of the punctuation. You're going to put Putnam, so the author's last name, and then you're going to put the year, and then comma, page number if you have one. If you don't have one, then your in-text citation would just look like this. But if you do have a page number, you want to put comma after the year, and then page 8, parentheses, right? And then period, quotation marks, okay? So that's how you cite things in Chicago style in terms of, well, in-text citations. Last thing I want to point out really quickly, oh, there's a little typo. If I wrote that you need to follow reading response instructions better, I probably wrote that because you're failing to cite the reading, the OpenStax textbook, and one outside credible source. If you look at the reading response instructions, I ask you to cite all 3 of these things. In addition to that, your paper should be single-spaced rather than double-spaced, and your paper should be organized into 4 paragraphs. Again, if you look at reading response instructions in that first module, you'll see that I want you to have an introduction, a first body paragraph where you summarize the reading, a second body paragraph where you analyze the reading, basically where you give me an argument and back up that argument with evidence, and then finally a conclusion, right? And then you, of course, should have a bibliography at the end of your paper based upon whatever sources you used in addition to the textbook and the supplemental reading. Okay, so let me know if you guys have any questions about this. This is just like some extra help on reading responses, but overall, you guys are doing awesome. So don't stress too much. And I hope you guys are staying safe and healthy. Okay, talk to you soon.